The smell of Port Nexus hit Thomas Reeves like a physical wall the moment he stepped off the transport. Recycled air, industrial lubricants, and something that might charitably be called food from a dozen different worlds. His new assignment as xenocultural mediator for the Galactic Trade Commission had seemed prestigious back on Earth, but the reality of frontier station life was proving considerably less glamorous than the recruitment holovids had suggested. "Welcome to the armpit of the galaxy," muttered his escort, a grizzled station administrator whose enthusiasm for his job had clearly died sometime during the previous administration. "Your quarters are in Section C, diplomatic housing. Try not to get mugged on your first day." Thomas adjusted his formal diplomatic coat and tried to look like someone who belonged in a place where three different species were conducting what appeared to be a heated argument about cargo manifests while a fourth species provided musical accompaniment. "Is it always this, chaotic? This is a slow day. Wait until you see what happens when the Chronari shipping fleet arrives." They made their way through the station's central plaza, a vast open space designed to accommodate the diverse needs of interspecies commerce. Merchants hawked goods from portable stalls, while overhead displays advertised everything from genuine earth coffee to Alterian mind crystals, satisfaction guaranteed or your sanity back. It was the crowd gathering near the plaza's center that first caught Thomas's attention. A circle of beings from multiple species, their voices rising in what sounded like collective anticipation. The administrator noticed his interest and checked his chronometer. "Ah, right. I forgot about the ceremony. You might want to see this, actually. Cultural education and all that." "What kind of ceremony?" "Valian justice ritual. They're about to perform a severing." Thomas had studied Valian culture during his diplomatic preparation, but only in broad overview. He knew them as a warrior species with elaborate honor codes and skin that shifted color based on emotional states. What he hadn't been prepared for was the reality of their justice system. The crowd parted slightly as they approached, revealing a scene that made Thomas's training in diplomatic neutrality collide violently with his basic human decency. In the center of the circle stood a Valian woman, completely naked, her metallic skin displaying the dull gray of utter shame. Her ears, longer and more delicately pointed than human ones, were pressed flat against her skull. Refuse and garbage struck her trembling form as members of her own species chanted words that needed no translation. "What has she done?" Thomas asked, his voice barely steady. "Violated honor codes. Exact nature doesn't matter. Once they decide on a severing, the condemned becomes legally dead to their society. This is the final ceremony before permanent exile." Another piece of rotting fruit splattered across the woman's chest, and Thomas watched her flinch but remained standing. Her eyes held a mixture of pain, defiance, and something that looked like relief that the ordeal would finally end. "How long does this continue?" "Until the ceremonial requirements are met. Could be hours." The administrator shrugged with the callousness of someone who'd seen too much. "Station policy is non-interference in cultural proceedings. Not our business how species handle their internal affairs." More garbage flew through the air. A chunk of something unidentifiable struck the woman's face, and Thomas saw her jaw tighten as she absorbed the impact without crying out. Her shame-gray skin flickered momentarily with defiant silver before returning to dull resignation. "She's nobly born," observed a Valian merchant standing nearby, his own skin displaying satisfied orange patterns. "See the facial bone structure. High caste family. Makes the fall even more satisfying." "What did she do?" Thomas found himself asking. "Refused a sanctified mating bond. Chose personal desires over duty to her bloodline." The merchant's skin shifted to disgusted brown. Then compounded the dishonor by pursuing forbidden research. Healing technologies instead of weapons. Disgusting perversion of Valian purpose. Thomas watched another wave of projectiles strike the condemned woman. She was beautiful, he realized, beneath the grime and shame marks. Her bone structure spoke of intelligence and determination, qualities that had apparently led her to this moment of ultimate degradation. "Diplomatic neutrality," he muttered to himself, reciting the first principle of his training. Respect for cultural diversity. Non-interference in internal affairs. But his diplomatic training hadn't prepared him for watching a sentient being stripped of all dignity while crowds cheered her suffering. His hands moved to his coat buttons without conscious decision. "What are you doing?" the administrator demanded as Thomas began removing his formal diplomatic jacket. "Something stupid," Thomas replied, and stepped into the circle. The effect was immediate and profound. The crowd's chanting faltered as a human in Trade Commission colors walked directly into the sacred space of Valiant Justice. Thomas moved with deliberate calm, ignoring the shocked faces and confused protests rising around him. The condemned woman's eyes widened as he approached. Up close, her skin showed intricate patterns beneath the shame gray, and her eyes held intelligence that no amount of cultural condemnation could diminish. Thomas could see her trying to process what was happening, why a stranger was walking toward her instead of joining the ritual abuse. Without a word, Thomas draped his coat over her shoulders, the heavy fabric covering her nakedness and transforming her from object of humiliation into protected individual. The diplomatic insignia caught the plaza's lighting, making it clear that this intervention carried official weight. Silence fell like a dropped stone. "By what right do you interfere with sacred justice?" demanded a Valiant official, his skin blazing with outraged red patterns. Thomas found his voice, though it came out steadier than he felt. "By the right of any being to offer comfort to another in distress. And by the authority vested in me as a representative of the Galactic Trade Commission to ensure the welfare of all individuals within this station's jurisdiction. She is condemned. Legally dead. Your interference violates." "My interference violates nothing," Thomas interrupted, his diplomatic training finally kicking in. "I'm not preventing your ceremony or challenging your cultural practices. I'm simply ensuring that a sentient being is treated with the basic dignity accorded to all individuals under galactic law." The woman beneath his coat trembled, and he felt her hand briefly touch his arm, a gesture so light he might have imagined it, but which carried more gratitude than words could convey. The Valiant official's skin cycled through several colors of frustrated rage. "This matter is not finished, human." "I wouldn't expect it to be," Thomas replied, though he was beginning to wonder what exactly he'd gotten himself into. As the crowd slowly dispersed, muttering complaints and disappointment at the interrupted spectacle, Thomas found himself alone with the woman he'd covered, his administrator escort having mysteriously vanished, and a growing realization that his first day as xenocultural mediator had just become significantly more complicated than the job description had suggested. The diplomatic incident reports began flooding Thomas's inbox before he'd even managed to get the woman safely to his quarters. Cultural interference complaint, urgent response required, violation of non-interference protocols, disciplinary review pending, and his personal favorite, possible diplomatic immunity breach, legal department consultation mandatory. Each message carried the electronic equivalent of barely contained panic from his superiors. "I don't suppose you have a name?" he asked his unexpected guest as she huddled on his couch, still wrapped in his diplomatic coat. Her skin had shifted from shame gray to a more neutral bronze, though patterns of distress still flickered across her arms. "Kira then of the 7th house," she replied, her voice carrying the melodic harmonics typical of her species. "Though that name holds no meaning now. I am severed. Legally dead to my people." "Well, you're sitting in my living room and drinking my coffee, so you seem pretty alive to me." Thomas handed her another cup of the synthesized beverage, which she'd declared surprisingly tolerable for alien sustenance. "What exactly did you do to earn this?" "Severing." Her ears flattened against her skull, and her skin displayed embarrassed purple patches. "I refused a mating bond sanctified by the Honor Council. The chosen male was." She paused, searching for diplomatic language, incompatible with my research interests. "Research interests? I study biotechnology. Specifically, applications for healing and regeneration rather than warfare. My intended bondmate believed such pursuits were unworthy of a warrior bloodline." Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. "You were exiled because you wanted to heal people instead of hurt them?" The situation is more complex than that. Valiant society is built upon warrior traditions. To pursue healing arts while rejecting sanctified bonds with military leaders is heretical. Her skin darkened to troubled blue. But there were other factors. Before she could elaborate, Thomas's door chimed with the particular tone reserved for official visitors. Through the security display, he could see two Valiant officials flanked by station security, their skin blazing with officious orange patterns. "Stay here," he told Kira then, grabbing a spare diplomatic jacket from his closet. "And try to look officially protected." The lead Valiant official introduced himself as Battlemaster Vextar, though his ceremonial armor suggested his battles were largely bureaucratic. "Mediator Reeves, you are harboring stolen cultural property. We demand immediate return of the condemned for proper completion of justice." "I'm harboring a sentient being seeking sanctuary under galactic protection laws," Thomas replied, accessing diplomatic protocols he'd hoped never to use. "And I believe you'll find that according to Trade Commission regulations, any individual claiming protection within diplomatic quarters receives temporary sanctuary status pending review. She is not an individual. She is severed. Legally dead. Funny thing about galactic law, it doesn't recognize cultural declarations of non-existence when applied to living beings." The second Valiant stepped forward, his skin cycling through patterns Thomas's cultural database identified as barely contained violence. "You interfere with sacred traditions, human. There will be consequences." "I'm sure there will be. But right now, those consequences will have to wait for proper legal review." After the officials left with threats of formal complaints and diplomatic sanctions, Thomas returned to find Kira then examining his food synthesizer with the fascination of someone encountering alien technology. "This device attempts to recreate nutrients through molecular assembly," she asked. "More or less. Why?" "My dietary requirements include several minerals your synthesizer classifies as decorative elements. I may need to supplement with actual geology." Thomas blinked. "You eat rocks?" "Specific mineral compounds, yes. Part of our metallurgical biology." She gestured to her color-shifting skin. "The pigmentation requires regular metallic intake." "Right. So I need to figure out how to feed someone who eats minerals while protecting you from your own people who want to finish publicly humiliating you." Thomas sat down heavily. "My xenocultural training did not cover this scenario." "Why did you help me?" Kira then asked suddenly. Thomas considered the question. "Because watching someone suffer while crowds cheer isn't entertainment, regardless of what cultural traditions say about it. Because dignity shouldn't be conditional on following predetermined social roles. And because..." He paused. "Because you looked like someone who deserved better." Her skin shifted to warm gold patterns he didn't recognize. "In my culture, such kindness is considered weakness. In my culture, refusing to help someone in need is considered weakness." They sat in comfortable silence while Thomas's communication system continued chiming with increasingly frantic messages from various bureaucratic offices. Finally, Kira then spoke again. "There is something you should know about my severing. The refused mating bond was not the primary reason for my exile." "What was?" "I discovered evidence that our honor codes have been artificially maintained by the military castes to prevent scientific advancement that might threaten their power structure. My research into healing technologies revealed genetic modifications made to our species centuries ago, modifications designed to enhance aggression and suppress cooperative instincts." Thomas set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "You're saying your entire warrior culture is artificially engineered?" "Not engineered. Modified and then culturally reinforced through honor codes that punish deviation from aggressive behaviors." Her skin displayed patterns of frustrated determination. "I was exiled not just for personal heresy, but for possessing evidence that could challenge the fundamental assumptions of our society. And this evidence? Hidden in biotechnology research that appears to be about healing applications but actually contains genetic analysis proving systematic cultural manipulation." Thomas looked at the woman on his couch, brilliant scientist, political refugee, and accidental revolutionary wrapped in his diplomatic coat. Kira then, I think we may have bigger problems than just getting you proper mineral supplements. Indeed. And I believe your simple act of kindness may have started something neither of us anticipated. Outside his quarters, Thomas could hear heated arguments in multiple languages echoing through the station corridors. His gesture of basic human decency was apparently causing diplomatic reverberations across several star systems. Well, he said finally, at least my first week won't be boring. Kira then's skin shifted to amused silver patterns. Thomas Reeves, I believe you have just made yourself the most important person in Valian history, and you accomplished it by sharing coffee and asking about mineral requirements. Great, Thomas muttered, watching another urgent message flash across his communication system. I always wanted to accidentally start an interstellar incident on my first day. 3 days into what Thomas had begun calling the diplomatic incident that ate my career, his quarters had become an unofficial embassy for Valian refugees. Word had spread through underground networks that a human mediator was providing sanctuary to severed individuals, and Thomas found himself managing a household that resembled a cross between a cultural center and a support group for alien outcasts. The mineral supplements are working well, reported Dr. Zendai, a former Valian biochemist whose exile had stemmed from researching nonviolent applications of their species' natural toxins. Though I believe the food synthesizer may be developing sentience from repeated requests for edible geology. It's been making sarcastic comments about my dietary choices, confirmed Melcaris, whose crime had been teaching young Valians mathematics instead of military tactics. Yesterday it suggested I might enjoy limestone with a hint of contempt. Thomas surveyed his living room, now equipped with meditation cushions designed for Valian physiology, mineral supplement dispensers, and what appeared to be a small forge for recreational metallurgy. I'm pretty sure this violates 17 different housing regulations. Only 15, corrected Kira then, who had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of their growing refugee community. I researched the station's diplomatic housing codes. We're operating within legal parameters, though barely. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that his spontaneous act of compassion had invoked what Kira then called the mantle of protection, an ancient Valian law he'd never heard of that made him legally responsible for her welfare. According to legal databases older than most galactic governments, his gesture of covering her with his coat during the severing ceremony had triggered protections that superseded modern diplomatic protocols. So I'm not just harboring refugees, he said, reading through the legal precedents Kira then had uncovered. I'm officially your protector under laws that predate the formation of the Trade Commission. The irony is delicious, observed Dr. Zendai. Ancient Valian law protecting exiles from modern Valian justice. What I don't understand, Thomas continued, is why these laws exist in the first place. If your culture is built on warrior traditions and honor codes, why would there be legal protections for people who violate them? Kira then's skin shifted to contemplative silver patterns. Because the current honor codes are not original to our species. The mantle of protection dates to before the cultural modifications I discovered in my research. This was becoming a recurring theme in Thomas's crash education about Valian history. Every day brought new evidence that their rigid warrior society was artificially constructed, maintained through systematic suppression of dissenting voices and historical revision. How many others know about this? He asked. More than the military castes realize, replied Melcaris. But fear of severing keeps most silent. Until now. What do you mean, until now? Dr. Zendai produced a data pad displaying communication logs. Your protection of Kira then has inspired others to share their research. We've been correlating data from dozens of exiled scientists, and the picture is becoming clear. Thomas examined the compiled evidence, genetic analyses showing artificial modification of aggression markers, historical records of systematic suppression of scientific advancement, cultural tracking data proving the gradual elimination of cooperative behaviors from acceptable social norms. It was a comprehensive indictment of everything the current Valian power structure claimed as sacred tradition. This could start a revolution, he said quietly. Or get us all killed, Dr. Zendai replied cheerfully. The military castes have significant investment in maintaining current power structures. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent chime from the station's general communication system. Thomas accepted the incoming transmission to find himself facing War Master Tekhan, whose ceremonial armor suggested he outranked everyone Thomas had dealt with so far. Mediator Reeves, you will surrender the stolen cultural assets immediately or face formal charges of harboring enemies of the Valiant state. War Master, with respect, I'm harboring individuals seeking legitimate sanctuary under established galactic law. If you have specific charges to file, I suggest you direct them through proper diplomatic channels. I am not requesting, human. I am demanding. We have evidence that your guests are spreading seditious materials designed to undermine legitimate cultural authority. Thomas glanced at the data pad full of evidence that Valiant cultural authority was anything but legitimate. What kind of seditious materials? Scientific analyses that contradict established historical record. Claims that our honor codes are artificially imposed rather than naturally evolved. Lies designed to weaken our species' warrior spirit. And if these analyses are accurate? The War Master's image flickered with rage. They cannot be accurate because they contradict sacred truth. We have tolerated your interference out of respect for diplomatic procedures, but our patience is not unlimited. After the transmission ended, Thomas found his refugee guests looking at him with expressions ranging from hope to terror. So, he said, anyone want to tell me what we do when an entire military power structure decides we're a threat to their existence? We fight back with the only weapons we have, Kira then replied, her skin blazing with determined gold. Truth, evidence, and the hope that other species will recognize justice when they see it. That's either very brave or completely insane. In my experience, said Dr. Zendai, the two are often indistinguishable. Thomas looked around his crowded quarters, filled with brilliant minds that had been discarded by their own culture for the crime of pursuing knowledge over violence. Right then. I guess we're starting a revolution. Actually, Melcaris observed, I believe we're finishing one that started centuries ago but was never allowed to succeed. Outside, Thomas could hear the rumble of approaching ships, Valiant military vessels that had just entered the station's docking bays. Whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it fast. Kira then, how quickly can we get this evidence distributed through galactic networks? Hours, if we can maintain communication access long enough. Then let's make sure the truth gets out before they can silence us. Thomas's diplomatic coat hung on its hook by the door, still carrying traces of the shane gray dust from that first day in the plaza. Soon, he suspected, it would see more dramatic service than its designers had ever intended. The confrontation Thomas had been dreading came not with military force, but with something far more powerful, the sound of young Valiant voices rising in protest throughout Port Nexus. Kira then's research data, distributed through galactic networks in the hours before War Master Tekhan's ships arrived, had reached Valiant colonies across 3 star systems and sparked the kind of uprising that history would remember. The youth settlements are in full revolt, reported Dr. Zendai, monitoring communication channels from Thomas's now fortified quarters. They're demanding access to the suppressed research, recognition of exiled scientists as cultural heroes, and immediate reform of the honor codes. Thomas watched through his window as Valiant protesters filled the station's plaza, their skin blazing with colors he'd never seen before, patterns that his cultural database identified as revolutionary fervor and demands for justice. The same space where Kira then had been humiliated now hosted crowds calling for the end of the system that had condemned her. How did this happen so fast? He asked. Truth has a way of spreading when people are finally ready to hear it, Kira then replied, her own skin displaying triumphant gold patterns. Our research provided proof of what many suspected but could never confirm. The younger generations have been questioning the honor codes for decades. The revolution's speed caught even the military castes off guard. War Master Tekhan's forces found themselves facing not isolated terrorists but system-wide civil disobedience that included significant portions of their own junior officers. When Valian military ships attempted to blockade communications arrays, their crews simply refused orders. "Sir," came a transmission from one ship commander, respectfully requesting clarification of our mission parameters. "Are we fighting our own people to suppress scientific research?" Thomas found himself thrust into the center of galactic attention as news services from dozens of species covered what reporters were calling the Port Nexus Revolution. His testimony before the Emergency Galactic Council session became the focal point of debates about cultural relativism, individual rights, and the limits of non-interference policies. "Honored counselors," he said, standing before the assembled representatives of 43 species, "I stand here not as someone who intended to start a revolution, but as someone who believed that basic dignity transcends cultural boundaries. When I covered Kirathan with my coat, I wasn't challenging Valian traditions, I was upholding universal principles that every member species of this council claims to support." Counselor Velthara of the Andromedan Collective leaned forward. "But Mediator Reeves, how do we balance respect for cultural diversity with intervention in internal affairs?" "By recognizing that systematic oppression disguised as cultural tradition isn't diversity, it's tyranny. The evidence presented by Valian scientists proves that their current honor codes were artificially imposed to maintain military control, not preserve authentic cultural values." The Council's decision, when it came, established precedents that would reshape interspecies relations for generations. Cultural practices that violated individual rights would no longer receive automatic protection under diversity laws. Species claiming traditional authority would be required to prove historical authenticity. Most importantly, individuals seeking protection from cultural persecution would receive council support rather than being returned to face punishment. Thomas's transformation from diplomatic mediator to director of interspecies cultural protection happened so quickly he barely had time to update his personal records. His new mandate included investigating cultural practices across council space and providing sanctuary for individuals fleeing systematic oppression disguised as tradition. "Your first assignment," explained Secretary General Harrison, "is establishing protection protocols for Valian refugees and supporting the transition to reformed cultural structures." "What about Kirathan and the others?" "They're heroes now. Dr. Kirathan has been appointed to head the first Valian Research Institute dedicated to peaceful sciences. The Council is funding facilities on 3 worlds, with full support for formerly exiled scientists." The personal resolution came 6 months later, in a ceremony that blended human and reformed Valian traditions in ways neither species had imagined possible. Thomas stood in the same plaza where he'd first seen Kirathan, now transformed into a memorial garden honoring victims of cultural oppression. "Thomas Reeves," Kirathan said, her skin displaying the most beautiful patterns he'd ever seen, colors that meant love, partnership, and shared commitment to justice. "Will you accept the bond of equals, sworn not in submission to authority but in dedication to protecting those who cannot protect themselves?" "I accept," Thomas replied, placing his hands over hers in the gesture that had replaced hierarchical bonding ceremonies in reformed Valian culture. Their wedding became a symbol broadcast across council space, human compassion and alien intelligence united in service to universal justice. Representatives from dozens of species attended, including young Valians whose skin blazed with colors their grandparents had never been allowed to display. "We've received over 300 applications from cultural refugees seeking protection," Thomas told Kirathan as they reviewed requests from across the galaxy. "Everything from artistic expression bans to forced career assignments to reproductive control systems." "Then our work is just beginning," she replied, her skin showing determined silver. "Every being deserves the right to choose their own path." Thomas looked around their shared quarters, now serving as headquarters for the Cultural Protection Initiative. The walls displayed art from liberated artists, scientific achievements from formerly suppressed researchers, and letters of gratitude from individuals whose lives had been transformed by the simple principle that dignity was universal. "Do you ever regret it?" Kirathan asked. "Your career was supposed to be quiet diplomacy and trade mediation. Instead you're running a revolution." Thomas considered the question, remembering the frightened, naked woman who had stood in this plaza while crowds hurled garbage at her trembling form. Then he looked at the brilliant scientist beside him, whose research was revolutionizing biotechnology across council space, whose courage had sparked changes that freed thousands of individuals from systematic oppression. "No regrets," he said finally. "Though I still think my coat deserves hazard pay." Kirathen's laughter filled their quarters with harmonics that spoke of joy, hope, and the sound of two beings who had found in each other not just love, but shared purpose in making the universe a more just place. Outside their windows, Port Nexus bustled with the energy of reformed societies, liberated individuals, and the ongoing work of building a galaxy where covering someone with a coat in their moment of greatest need was recognized not as diplomatic interference, but as the most natural response of any decent being to another's suffering. The revolution they'd started with a simple act of human kindness continued expanding across the stars, one protected individual at a time.